So I'd very much like to welcome, first of all, Matt Pitts from Plantlife to this meeting. He's going to be speaking about the conservation of juniper. Here in Cambridgeshire, we do have some supposedly native juniper plants on the Fleam Dyke. There's also a nursery area where trees have been transplanted or raised from seedlings. And what's really quite exciting is they are setting seed themselves. So we do have what seems to be a reasonably self-sustaining population, although in fact the trees on the dike need a bit of help because the young seedlings often get grazed by rabbits. So when we see one, a tree guard gets put around it and away it goes. But anyway, I'm sure that Matt knows much more about these plants than I do. So Matt, over to you.
Lovely, thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be here this afternoon. Yeah, my name's Matt Pitts and I'm the grassland advisor for Plantlife. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of some of the work we've been doing around juniper and how we've used BSBI juniper records to help our sort of targeting of the right locations to start some of the restoration work that we've been engaged with, particularly over the last year or so. But this is off the back of project work that's been going on for much longer than just a year. So, and really wanted to highlight, I suppose, the value of data and how we use that. So the first slide here is juniper records, so common juniper mostly, in the sort of across England. And this is one of our sort of starting points for making decisions about where we might start restoration projects for juniper. So using those records at that kind of that sort of national level. And then we started to focus down more on the south of England. And I'm sure a lot of you are quite aware of juniper's strong connection to the chalk landscapes of the south of England. And we're also able to look back, obviously, because we've got records going back, and we can see that these populations of juniper across the south have massively declined over the last sort of 70 or 80 years for a whole range of reasons. Some of which was just alluded to in terms of changes in land management and grazing, and a lot of these very small juniper populations that still survive in these chalk landscapes still survive on areas of chalk grassland in a more intensively farmed landscape, and lots of places they've disappeared because the land use has changed. So I can focus down even closer. So one of the areas that we knew we wanted to start working in was down in Wiltshire, not far from where we're based in Salisbury. So we can start to use BSBI records, and then we can start to pull in lots of other data as well. So that really starts to give us a really good understanding about what's going on in the landscape. And this is before we've even been out there and physically had a look. So this is kind of purely on a sort of desk-based level. The screen you can see there has got the juniper records, or at least some of the juniper records on there. It's also got SSSI designations. It's also got UK priority habitat data as well, so we can start to kind of build a bit of a picture about what is important in a landscape, both from a landscape point of view, but also from a habitat and from a species point of view. And obviously those other records really do help us to kind of hone in and focus on where we might want to start doing restoration work. So again, the same shot here, so an aerial photo. If you look in that circle there that I've highlighted, you'll see there's a strange white triangle in the middle there, or a diamond shape, I guess maybe you could call it. That was one of an early trial that Plantlife did in the sort of mid-2000s, where we did a whole load of trial plots across the south of England in the hope that we would start to get naturally regenerating juniper. And again, that work was done really off the back of previous records that showed that juniper was massively declining in the south of England. So off the back of that work, we had the confidence to start doing this on a much larger scale. So again, that area there within the blue circle is partly SSSI, partly not SSSI. And when we physically go out and look on that site, we've got scattered old junipers kind of surviving underneath secondary woodland and scrub, and often associated with old historic features such as sunken trackways, old quarries, because again, we know about the ecology of juniper. We know it requires disturbance and it requires bare ground to get it to naturally regenerate. So those existing populations generally are associated with some of these, often associated with some of these old historic features. So again, we can pull in other data to sit alongside these records, these historic juniper records. So we're looking here at a 1930s aerial of the same location. And you can see there the complete change, between 1940 and the present day. I mean, in the 1940s, the majority of the landscape here was open downland, and it was grass at that time, grassland. So it was kind of sheep walks. And of course, we go to the present day there, and the majority of the landscape there is arable. So all of those kind of light brown coloured patches, pretty much all arable. So they've all been converted to arable in the last sort of 60 or 70 years. Of course, we know that there would have been more juniper in this landscape, but it's just kind of disappeared because it's been removed and grubbed and ploughed away. So it only survives in these kind of fragmented places on these nice bits of chalk downland, some triple SI, some not triple SI. So there's that's part of the rationale for us deciding this is a place where we want to go back and see if we can get juniper naturally regenerating in this particular area. So yeah, and of course, if you look at this more closely, and we bring all of this data into the GIS system, we can zoom into this area here under that circle, and we can see that there's basically a scatter of scrub, which is now all reverted back to woodland. The likelihood is that some of that scrub was juniper. In fact, when we look inside that woodland today, we can see some of these skeletal bushes of juniper that basically completely disappeared under the secondary woodland canopy and died. So same area. This was before we'd started doing any of the restoration work. So yeah, I mean, what we're looking at there is a series of historic trackways. And of course, they didn't get ploughed because they were old, lumpy, bumpy, sunken tracks, probably medieval. And the land adjacent to that is part of the triple SI and has been grazed historically and is reasonably nice quality chalk grassland. But obviously over time, this area has had less and less grazing on it. And of course, the secondary woodland started to get hold on these sunken tracks. And of course, the juniper then just completely disappeared underneath that. So the aim of the project here was to try and liberate some of the junipers that were still surviving under this secondary woodland, but also allow us to create some bare ground that we could then go and collect berries and then process those berries and sow juniper berries back into some of this bare ground that we've created in this particular area. So yeah, last winter, a fair amount of secondary woodland was cleared on this particular site. You get a better sense now of these kind of lumps and bumps, these old historic sunken trackways. And if you look in the far distance in this photo, you can just see right in the back there are still some surviving junipers in gaps in the canopy that haven't been completely shaded out. So yeah, we've still got some. The reality is though, a lot of these juniper bushes are probably sort of between 60 and 70 years old. And when they get to that age, the seed viability starts to drop massively. So in terms of getting very much natural regeneration, in fact, any really in this kind of context, because it's just completely dark and there's very little exposed soil and enough sunlight. So, the work we're doing is really trying to kickstart that process, that natural process, I guess, as much as anything. So yeah, so this was last year. So literally this was just as a result of clearance of those trees. We're already starting to see some of that, the chalk grassland flora coming back in to these sunken hollowways. No juniper yet, because juniper is going to take a few more years, and we've got to sow juniper berries and seeds onto those areas. But yeah, certainly already cowslips and greater butterfly orchids coming back into these areas that have just had the sunlight levels massively increased. So along with clearance of scrub to try and restore some of these areas where we had juniper, the other side of the project is also carefully selecting areas of fairly uninteresting grassland, which again sit adjacent to some of these existing very small populations of aging juniper, to create these big areas of bare ground that we can then go and collect juniper and sow juniper seed back into these scraped areas as well. And again, this is based on work that was done 10 or 12 years ago. where we did this series of sort of test scrapes across the UK, and then we came back and revisited those scrapes and found that we'd had really, really good success in natural regeneration of juniper. So yeah, I mean, this year's work has really been on quite a large scale. So we've worked in 2 discrete landscapes. We've worked with around 6 or 7 landowners down in Wiltshire, and then we've worked with another landowner up in the Oxfordshire Downs as well. So both on the sort of chalk landscapes, and both using, you know, that juniper data, that BSBI data as a way of sort of focusing the work and targeting the best locations for doing this, along with all of those other sets of data that we can kind of pull together into the software, into the GIS software, which kind of, you know, really kind of highlights, I think, the value and the power of this kind of information. So again, just a sort of example of the sort of scale of what we're doing. So scraping off the topsoil there to reveal this kind of rubbly chalk. So in effect, that's very similar to what you might have had around a quarry or on one of these sunken roofs where you know, you've got this kind of exposed bare ground, and then we're collecting the berries. The berries are then being processed to remove the seed, and then they're being scattered in effect or broadcast onto these scrapes. And then we're literally letting natural regeneration take hold on its own. The typical sort of size of these scrapes is around sort of 15 by 20 meters, so they're reasonable size. In this one sort of area of chalk downland here, we've done, I think, 7 or 8 scrapes of that size just in this one area. So, and again, work here, removal of scrub on this site here. So you've got existing juniper bushes on this bank here of chalk downland. Again, most of those very old. Some work looking at the viability of the seed in these populations, probably got about 1% viability of the juniper on that bank. So virtually no natural regeneration happening here at all. So, and again, partly because there's so much scrub encroachment, and also because there's just no bare ground for any of that seed to fall on and then to germinate. So we're kind of, again, coming in there and kickstarting that process. So this is just an example of one of these scrapes from that original work that was done 10 years ago. So this is the scrape that was revisited 10 years ago. Sorry, this was revisited in 2019. So you get a sense as to how quickly, certainly some of the chalk grassland species come back into these areas, because again, there's absolutely no competition from grass and from other things. This scrape was fenced to prevent any kind of grazing. So in here, I mean, we've got pyramidal orchids in here, we've got kidney vetch, we've got quaking grass, glaucous sedge, knapweed, you know, a lot of the really sort of, you know, some of the really nice chalk grassland species, common spotted orchid eyebrights, you know, which have all come back completely of their own accord from the adjacent chalk grassland sward that's kind of fairly nearby to this. So no sowing at all has been done here. This is all purely natural regeneration. And if you look in the very, very far distance there, you can see poking out, you've got juniper bushes as well on the site. So the red flags there represent juniper. So we went back and counted the juniper bushes in this particular scrape, which is in Hampshire. And after 10 years, we had 77 juniper bushes recorded in this scrape here. And that was obviously sown through the same process that I described we're doing this year, 10 years ago. So you get a sense, you know, so I guess this work that we did 10 years ago gave us the confidence to know that this kind of approach was going to be successful, provided we could create the right conditions for the juniper to naturally regenerate. So I think that's all I'd like to say.
That's brilliant, Matt. It certainly gives me some ideas for what I should be suggesting to our local wildlife trust to get the plants on Fleam Dyke to do better. I believe we're supposed to be going back there in the fairly near future. So I'll suggest that we collect some berries off the bushes and scatter them in the bare chalk, because there's been a lot of clearance of scrub done on the Fleam Dyke recently. So it seems an ideal.
We actually found that the processing of the berries to remove the seeds from the flesh is obviously a really beneficial thing. The seeds they're a dormant seed anyway, so they need periods of cold weather and then warm weather and cold weather to actually stimulate the seeds to germinate. So because typically they would be eaten by a bird, and then they would pass through the bird, obviously, and then the seed would be exposed. But of course, that doesn't happen as frequently. And of course, there's no guarantee that those seeds will then fall in the right place. Yeah. So, yeah, so definitely the processing of the berries has been the key to this being successful in most places.
So there's plenty of questions come in, and we have got time to deal with some of these. So Cameron Miller asks, what was done with the removed topsoil from the scrapes?
Good question, actually. I mean, that was something of a consideration for us because we're often working in protected landscapes here. We were mostly working in designated landscapes, and we were working adjacent often to triple SIs. So, I mean, we were quite lucky because we were working with arable farmers, and most of those arable farmers were willing to take the topsoil away, and they were basically able to spread it onto their arable land. So we had to kind of coordinate the timing of the scraping so that they'd remove the harvested crop, and then they would provide tractors and trailers. And as the topsoil was being scraped away, it would then be removed and it would be spread straight back onto the arable land. So because there is a concern, obviously, of leaving a load of topsoil adjacent to a scrape, you end up with a whole load of plants that we might not necessarily want. So yeah, absolutely. So we were quite fortunate in that respect.
Falconer asked why no plug plants, but I think your final slides show exactly why no plug plants.
I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're not necessarily, and partly because we're putting these adjacent to already good quality bits of habitat generally. You know, so you know, provided there's going to be a natural seed rain, and those species are going to come in on their own, and obviously we're going to get a more natural population by doing that and trying to, you know, because they're, you know, obviously you can go through and you can collect seed and you can harvest and you can spread green hay and all this kind of stuff to get that chalk grassland kind of turf going, but we found that just natural regeneration has been much better for both the juniper and for the sort of, you know, those chalk grassland species as well.
So John Swindles asks, is there anywhere that we can read about the activity and results of the scraping? Is that in the Plantlife?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, we are in the process of putting some information together. So the work we're doing currently has been funded by the government's green recovery projects, which a lot of environmental NGOs have been working on, doing all sorts of things over the last year as a result of this money. So yeah, there is a small amount of information on the Plantlife website at the moment, but there will be a load more by the end of March, and it'll go into some of the historical work that was done and look at some of the survey work and the sort of plight of juniper historically and why we're in the situation we're in, particularly in the south of England. And then, yeah, a bit more detail about what's been done. And we're also planning to do a lot more of this over the next 10 years. This is a priority for us in the south of England, particularly because we know that these populations of juniper probably will disappear in the next between sort of 40 and 50 years because they're just aged and they're not naturally regenerating in most places. And it's a relatively short-lived tree or shrub, so compared to some.
Yeah. Fal has another question. And did you see any juniper gall?
I haven't seen. I've seen pictures, but no, I haven't. No.
I'll have to look at and see what our Fleam Dykes plants have next time I'm there.
Yeah.
Mary Dean asks, will the newly sown areas and new cleared areas at any rate need fencing to protect juvenile juniper plants? So did you put any tree guards around them?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, the reality is we probably won't get germination for between 2 and 3 years just because of this dormancy process and the seeds having to be exposed to cold weather over a relatively long period. So typically they probably won't germinate until the 2nd year. So we've sown seeds through the winter this year. So it's unlikely we'll see any germination probably until next spring, I suspect. So yeah, we've always got the option to guard and protect those junipers. But in some of the scrapes that we did 10 years ago as part of this original trial, we've had grazing on those sites and we've still had juniper regenerating. So it depends very much on the site, and obviously every site's slightly different. So it depends if there's a lot of rabbit pressure, that obviously can have a massive impact. But if you've only got seasonal grazing, you know, late summer, autumn with fairly low intensity stock, which often you will have in a chalk grassland kind of context, that doesn't seem to be such a problem. So we have the option to fence. Yeah,
I think that possibly answers the next question from Liz McDonald, who asked, how are these areas managed? Is it grazing?
Yeah, I mean, initially, as you say, I mean, you know, the small juniper kind of seedlings, and even in the first 4 or 5 years, they're very susceptible and they're still quite palatable by rabbits, by deer as well, and by sheep, probably not so much by cattle. So yeah, there is a concern in the first 4 or 5 years until they're well established. but yeah, I mean, mostly they're in a habitat, or at least in the context of a kind of grassland and mature grassland habitat. So they are typically sort of late summer, autumn grazed sites. Yeah.
I think that's all the questions. Thank you very much for giving up your Sunday afternoon to come and speak to us. It's certainly given me lots of ideas for what we should be doing on a local basis. And hopefully others across southern England will take note of the results and how to get things going. And it will certainly be fantastic to have more juniper recolonisation across some of our chalk grassland areas. And maybe we should encourage it to appear in some newer areas where perhaps historically, at least locally, it's not been seen. And just have it as translocation sites. So if I find a few berries, I might take them across to Magog Down or somewhere like that and see what comes up in due course. So thank you very much indeed.
That's all right. Well, thank you very much for